if we remember back to the lead up to World War I, or at least the United States' involvement in World War I, that war breaks out in 1914, and the United States doesn't join until 1917. So it's sort of a 3-year period of gradually becoming less and less neutral. Now, when you're talking about the Second World War, in some ways, you can look to the early 1930s with efforts in Japan relative to China, or 1935 as Germany starts militarizing, or I should say remilitarizing, and the war really starts in 1939, and then the United States doesn't get involved in 1941. So while the war is going on for a shorter period of time before the United States joins, there's actually a longer period of time in which the United States is really sitting on the sidelines, playing some minor role, and as that increases over time, up until after Pearl Harbor when the United States joins the war. Now, when we think about FDR, now FDR, of course, is elected in 1933. He's quote-unquote already fighting a war, and that's going to be, again, the economic distress that the country is going through. So his focus really is on domestic economic crises. The United States in the 1920s, of course, had become really, the economic top dog and was trading with other countries around the world, despite what ultimately will happen with Smoot-Hawley tariff, or the Hawley-Smoot tariff, that really, does reduce international trade at the end of the 1920s. But the United States generally is isolationist when it comes to foreign policy. And people in America were very, very glad to just be like, we are going to stay out of international affairs and focus on what happens at home, because we feel in many ways that getting involved in World War I didn't really change anything. We idealistically went over there with Wilsonian bubbles that we were blowing, and in the end, well, what really changed? So when we pay attention to the lead up to World War II, and as well as World War II itself, we have to think of this term fascism, because what we're going to see particularly in Germany, in Italy, and to some extent in Japan, is this idea where there's a totalitarian government in which a dictator uses propaganda and brute force, violence, to seize control of all aspects of national life: the economy, the armed forces, the legal and education systems, and the press. Now, in our mind, we tend to associate sort of this dictatorship not only with fascism, but with communism. And frankly, that's not true, because at their root, they're very, very different. In fact, fascism is much more about sort of a rigid class system and sort of social Darwinistic thinking and violence, and where communism is definitely not. It's much more about an egalitarian, equal setup where the government, again, is owning the means of production. That's not how communism ended up being implemented, but at their heart, they are very, very different. So don't confuse the two. Now, fascism thrives in Germany and Italy. We have Hitler in Germany. We have Mussolini in Italy, with this sort of very violent, ultra-nationalistic patriotism. There's this idea of really returning to past glory when you think about fascism. And there's this hysterical emotionalism. And again, we've talked about this term before with demagogues, not in the same level here in America, but people like Father Coughlin or even Huey Long, okay? And in fascism, you really appeal to this idea of racial superiority, and you're also building on the resentment that grew out of the defeat in World War I. Now, of course, Italy is on the winning side, technically, in World War I, but they really don't benefit all that much. In Germany, of course, we know with the guilt clause and the disarmament and having to pay $33 billion back, they are certainly very, very angry and resentful. Now, Japan's a different story. So over in Japan, the government is under control of expansionists that are eager to conquer China and most of Asia. Now, for a long time, Japan was really insular, looking into itself. But in this era, it's really starting to look to expand, because Japanese leaders, much like the German leaders, are convinced that they are a master race and that they have this mission to lead a resurgent Asia. And we're going to see, again, Japan and Germany both making moves. We focus, more so on Hitler, in part because of the fact that it's in Western Europe and we're sort of more cognizant of what's going on in Western Europe. But the efforts in Japan, certainly by the Japanese expansionists, are ultimately what does finally draw the United States into war. Now, we're going to take a step back here. So we're going to look at the 1930s. So in Japan, in the early 30s, you have 10,000 Japanese troops that occupy Manchuria in northeastern China. Now, it's important to understand China is huge, obviously, versus Japan, which is much, much smaller. And Japan covets this very raw material rich area in China that's got deposits of iron ore and coal. And China's weakened at this point by a civil war between the communists, led by Chairman Mao Zedong, and the nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek. Apologies for the mispronunciations. And this civil war is going to be ongoing and is actually going to go all the way through the 1940s and really have ramifications in 1949 after the war. But Japan is going to take advantage of these Chinese weaknesses to proclaim this particular area, Manchuria, independent, naming it the Republic of Manchukuo. I always say this wrong. Manchukuo, sorry. In 1934, Japan is going to begin a very aggressive military buildup in anticipation of conquering all of Asia. So we'll get more on that in a little bit, okay? So Japan is making moves. Now, Italy, under Il Duce Mussolini, launches Italy's reconquest of Ethiopia. Now, Ethiopia, again, in Africa, they had controlled Ethiopia until the late 1890s. And the League of Nations is going to look at Mussolini and be like, seriously, you are an aggressor and a brute. You are literally just traveling across the Mediterranean to beat up on people that are far inferior to you. And Mussolini sort of looks at the League of Nations like, guys, why are you on Ethiopia's side? Why are you on Africa's side? But in many ways, this is a classic, really fascist nationalist move, which is, you know what? We're going to all come together by going to beat up on an inferior foe. And again, League of Nations doesn't end up doing anything about it, ultimately. Now, once Hitler has risen to power in the early 1930s, by 1935, he feels like he is ready to start making his moves, and he's not really concerned about what any Western European countries are going to do. So he violates the Treaty of Versailles, and he begins rebuilding Germany's army in 1935. That's his first move. Second move in 1936 is to send 35,000 soldiers into the Rhineland, which had been the demilitarized buffer between France and Germany that, again, had come as a result of the punishment of Germany at the end of World War I. And Great Britain and France don't enforce the Treaty of Versailles, and again, the United States is not part of the League of Nations, so it's rather toothless overall. So Hitler starts to realize, much as a kid would do if their parents don't punish them, you know what? I'm going to keep pushing the envelope because it doesn't seem like anyone's going to stop me. Now, we also need to note what's going on in Spain. And you say, Spain, well, what does Spain have to do with this? Well, there's a Spanish Civil War going on where General Franco's nationalists, who are supported by the Catholic Church, take on the Republican government. Now, this Spanish Civil War is really going to be a testing ground because Hitler and Mussolini look at this and say, wow, we can actually help out one side and sort of see how all of our military apparatus is going to do. So those two guys send troops and warplanes and military and financial aid to aid their fascist ally, General Franco. Now, again, it's a small deal in the overall European theater, but again, it's a civil war going on, and we'll see how it plays a role in American neutrality in just a little bit. Now back to Japan in 1937. So again, Japanese and Chinese soldiers have been fighting, again, in part because of Japanese moves that go all the way back to Manchuria in the early 1930s. And they're going to have a famous clash at the Marco Polo Bridge in China near Beijing. And ultimately, that battle really sort of spills into what is known as the Sino-Japanese War, or the Chinese-Japanese War. And the Japanese during this war are going to capture Nanjing, where the Japanese soldiers infamously loot the city and murder and rape civilians. And 300,000 Chinese are killed in what is known as the Rape of Nanjing. And again, while we spend most of our time focusing on Hitler and Germany, it's really important to note that the United States is very disturbed by what is going on with Japan relative to China. And by 1940, 1941, it's really going to come to a head. So, when we talk about neutrality, we're really talking about neutrality from what's going on in Europe. And the United States does not want to make the same mistakes that it had made in World War I, where it claimed neutrality, but in the end ended up trading so much more with the Allies. So you're going to see the Neutrality Act of 1935, which is the first. And it prohibits selling weapons or traveling on ships owned by nations at war. Again, in the lead up to World War I, the United States was absolutely selling to nations at war. Now, the Neutrality Act of 1936 barred loans to warring nations. Now, absolutely the United States had done this in World War I. So again, trying to avoid this whole idea that there were people who said that World War I, the United States had gotten into just to benefit the merchants of death, people, the bankers, the weapons makers. So at this point, the neutrality is going to try to, undo, or I should say correct, many of those quote-unquote mistakes from earlier on. Now, the Neutrality Act of 1937, I am not quite sure why Tyndall says that it introduces this policy of cash and carry. We really don't see that until a couple years later. So don't know why it says that. It's true, but not really to a major extent. What is more important in my mind that Tyndall doesn't say is that the Neutrality Act of 1937 says the United States cannot intervene on either side in a civil war. That's specifically speaking to the Spanish Civil War, even though people in America were on the side of the Republicans against the fascist nationalists led by Franco, but technically the United States could not come in on either side. So now we're going to move to sort of Hitler's moves. And anytime you think of Hitler's moves, you got to sort of think of like what the United States or Western Europe did to check him. And in many cases, that was nothing. So Hitler first, of course, remilitarizes, okay? Then he takes the Rhineland. Then he's going to try to take Austria, which he does, in something called Anschluss. And this was Hitler's triumphant return to his native country. So it's important that you know that he's going to sort of take back his fatherland. And it's important that there are German-speaking people throughout this entire area. So it's not like he's just taking over Austria, which has no connection to Germany to begin with, okay? After Austria, Hitler gets bold, and he threatens to take the Sudeten territory. We know it as Sudetenland, which is a mountainous region in western Czechoslovakia along the German border where more than 3 million ethnic Germans live. And Hitler's claim is, these are Germans, we're taking back the German people. Now, the Germans and the French famously, or I should say infamously, appease Hitler. And that's the term that is used at the Munich conference. And in this Munich pact, Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of Britain, famously says, by doing this, we have preserved peace in our time. The whole idea was, we've given Hitler what he wanted, and he has said that he will stop as a result. But, as we know, that is not the case. 6 months later, Hitler breaks his word when he takes the rest of Czechoslovakia. So, remilitarizes, takes the Rhineland, takes Austria, takes the Sudetenland, takes Czechoslovakia. So now we're seeing this whole line of territory that he has taken. But Poland becomes the big issue. Because if Hitler can conquer Poland, it would give him a clear path into the USSR, particularly Ukraine, which was very, very valuable. Now, Hitler is anti-communist. Again, fascism and communism are really antithetical to each other. But he does the unthinkable when he signs the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact with Stalin. Now, Stalin was an anti-fascist leader, so this marriage made no sense, except for the fact that they both coveted Poland. So the world is stunned. Like, I can't believe they're getting together. But if you think about it, both of them wanted Poland, and they agree to really divide it as well as areas in and around Poland. So they come together for really the spoils of war. Now, on the 1st of September, so 9/1/39, very important date, 1.5 million German troops invade Poland from basically the north, the south, and the west. Of course, you can't come really from the east if you're coming from Germany. And this is the last straw, because after having watched Hitler take the Rhineland and Austria and Sudetenland and the rest of Czechoslovakia, Great Britain and France had said, if you attack Poland, we are in. So that is really considered the start of the war when Hitler invades Poland and he and the Soviet Union are on the same side. Now, as a result, you're going to have an amended Neutrality Act. So the Neutrality Act of 1939 allows for Great Britain and France to send their ships to the United States to bring back military supplies. This is known as cash and carry. So American ships won't be involved. There won't be loans. It's going to be simply at cash. But now the United States is incrementally getting itself more involved. And we're going to follow that sort of lessening of neutrality in the next lecture.